I'm a grateful member of Al-Anon, and my name is Angie.
Hi, Angie.
My home group is the Happy Destiny Al-Anon Family Group in Destin, Florida. I bring you greetings from my group. I also attend 3 Zoom meetings a week that I've been attending now for over 3 years, and feel such a part of those groups as well. It was really exciting. I went to the Al-Anon International Convention in Albuquerque, New Mexico a few weeks ago and got to meet a number of people that I have become so close with, even a couple of ladies that I sponsor, that I've been sponsoring for about 3 years, but I had never seen them in person. So you talk about hugs and tears and laughter. It was just wonderful. I also want to thank every speaker that has spoken so far from this microphone this weekend. I will tell you that my bucket is already full. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You have just been phenomenal. I want to thank the committee and those responsible for my being here, and I really, really, really want to thank Brenda. We have just had a wonderful time together. She gets 5 gold stars from me for maneuvering that Denver airport. It is really something. They need to do a reality show about people going through the Denver airport. And then she took us to a wonderful place for lunch, and she had an umbrella for me. She surprised Chip and I, had all of our luggage put in our room. That's never happened to me before. She has just been phenomenal, just terrific. So thank you so much. And I'm glad to be here. I've heard so much about Fellowship of the Spirit, Colorado, and I can see why. You truly, you can't walk outside without believing that there's something besides me around. Wow, what a view you have, and what a warmth of spirit as well. I heard somebody say one time that Al-Anon is all about relationships, and I would agree with that. I do believe that it is. But also for me, it's been a lot about hope, and it's been a lot about miracles, and I hope that I will get to share some of those with you tonight. I was raised in a military family, so what that meant for me was we were always moving, thinking about moving, getting ready to move, packing, unpacking. That was my life story for many years. My dad was an Army officer. He was not an alcoholic. He truly was a social drinker. There really are such people, and my dad was one of those. I saw him a little tipsy a few times in my life, and it would always be after a military function. He would come in, and he would be so happy. And he would go over to the phone and get out his address book, and he would start calling all of his old military buddies. And they would reminisce on the phone and tell stories with each other. And I love those times because my dad taught very little about his military career. And so I got to hear those stories on the phone, and it was fun and wonderful to me when that would happen. My mother was an alcoholic who was quite physically abusive to me growing up, so she and I had a pretty tumultuous relationship with each other until I got older. I have a brother, Glenn, who is 7 years older than I am, and Glenn is a math and science genius. He really is. And he also excelled in any sport that involved a ball. He was the quarterback on the football team, the pitcher on the baseball team, the forward on the basketball team, whatever you are on the golf league, whatever you are with the bowling league, he was it. And I thought about that one time, and I thought, gosh, whenever we moved, there already was a quarterback. There already was a pitcher. You see what I'm saying? But my brother would just get in there, and he would just fit right in, and he had all these friends, and he was just a star. And then there was me, and I lived my life in books. I believe I've read every day of my life since I learned the alphabet. And for me, I wasn't a star in the military family because, you see, I learned pretty early that if I said hello to you, that meant I was going to have to say goodbye to you. And I did not like saying goodbye. So I learned not to say hello very often. But I could fall in love with the characters in those books and the places in those books and the people in those books, and I never had to tell them goodbye. And so that was my family. And if you saw us, you would think, boy, look at the Rayleigh family. Aren't they something? They are really a great family. But inside our family, we were really 4 islands that lived under one roof. We came together every night for dinner because that was very important to my mother. And then we just went to our individual islands, and that's pretty much how we lived. Of course, growing up, there came a time that the opposite sex became quite attractive to me. And this is what he was like back then. He was tall, had dark hair. He'd walk in a room and people would say, oh, look, he's here, he's here. Everybody would be so excited to see him. He could tell story after story. He could make you believe anything. He knew how to treat a woman when he was dating her. He knew the right things to say. He knew how to say them. He knew how to dress. Also, in my experience, he had either been sexually and or physically and or emotionally abused growing up. He sexually and or physically and or emotionally abused the women that he was involved with. He didn't have a clue about feelings. He did express one, anger, in very inappropriate ways. He sure didn't know how to handle conflict or communicate about anything below a surface kind of level. And I realized one day, after many years, that he was me. He was me. You see, that's who I was too. I understand selfishness, self-centeredness, fear, resentment, anger. I understand all of those things. I have much more in common with alcoholics than I do differences. In addition, I would lie when it would be just as easy to tell the truth. Sometimes I would lie and I would think, Angie, why did you lie about that? There was no reason to lie, but I would just lie. I also believed if she would let me be in charge of the world and everybody in it, we would all be so much better off. I had absolutely no ego, did I? I could manipulate with the best of them. I was kind of bored with normal. It wasn't very exciting to me, so if things were normal very long, I would just stir up some chaos. And I was so good at it that when everything was over, you would apologize to me for the chaos you had created. I'm not proud that that's who I am. And you heard me say that is who I am. That is always who I'll be. And I'm not proud of that. But because I work a transformative program, I don't have to be that woman today. I can stand before you and most people, most days, as a woman of dignity and grace. And I can speak my truth in kindness and love. And I can do that most days that I work this program. I don't do it every day. There are times I have to make amends. I have to set things right. But most days I can because of the program that I work. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Everybody involved in recovery programs. So, his wounded heart would call out to my tortured soul, and we would join hands together, and we would walk off into the sunset to live happily ever after. And for me, it just never worked. It just didn't. Short-term marriages, short-term relationships, they just didn't work. Finally, in 1978, I was living in a small town in South Alabama. I know you cannot tell I've ever lived in the South. The name of the town was Andalusia, and I went to my first Al-Anon meeting. And it was at a church, and when we walked in that night, there was a lady standing in the doorway that I can see tonight as well as I saw her that night. Her name was Miss Ina. It was 1978, so she had this tall, brown, bouffant hairdo with curls everywhere. She had glasses on a chain around her neck. She was wearing a royal blue silk dress that had a belt around the waist. She had on black patent leather high-heeled shoes. She had her hose on. She had her jewelry on. And she held out her hand and she said, honey, you come with me. You know, there may be somebody standing behind a podium 40-something years from now describing what you look like this weekend when you greeted them here and you welcomed them here. Miss Ina held out her hand and I went in, and that was my first Al-Anon meeting. Now, I can't tell you one thing that was said that night. Sometimes great events happen in our lives, and we don't realize that they're great events, and that's just the way that night was for me. But I can tell you this, she gave me this One Day at a Time book that night, and I knew I was home. I knew I was home. My friend that had taken me to the meeting on the way home that night said, well, how did you like the meeting? I said, oh, I loved it, but I don't think I can go back. And he said, why not? And I said, well, I don't know any alcoholics. Now, please understand, by this time I had been married to several alcoholics. All my great uncles were alcoholic. My favorite uncles were alcoholic. My favorite aunt was an alcoholic. My mother was an alcoholic. But you see, to me, they were my uncles. It was Uncle Vernon. It was Aunt Mud. It was my mother. It was my ex-husband's. I did not associate the behaviors they had with the disease of alcoholism at that time. Well, my friend said, well, you know me. He was in recovery. And I did know him, but I don't know how things were here in 1978. But in South Alabama in 1978, Al-Anon was made up of women who were married to the men that went to an AA meeting at the same time that met in a different room at that church. And that's what Al-Anon was. And you see, that's not who I was. So while I identified very strongly with the message, I didn't identify so much with the messengers. I'm so grateful today that Al-Anon is made up of all kinds of us, from all walks of life and all kinds of places. So I was in and out of Al-Anon for about 12 years. I would go a while, then I'd run out there and mess up another relationship, and I'd run back to Al-Anon, and I'd learn a little bit more to be dangerous, and I'd run back out there and do more stuff, and I'd run back in. Finally, June 15th, 1990, I said, Angie, you are so blessed. Number one, you have found Al-Anon. You know, most people never find us. Lois Wilson was Bill Wilson's wife, and she was the co-founder of Al-Anon. She was quite concerned about that. She even wrote about it. She said, we are not a secret society. We are not a secret society. She said, you know, people will read in the newspapers about us being arrested for driving while drinking or doing other things while drinking, but how are they going to get the good news of recovery? How are people going to get the good news of recovery? You know, I worry about that too sometimes. How are people going to get the good news of recovery? Well, I had gotten it. And number two, I could choose to stay. Most people that do find Al-Anon don't choose to stay. They learn that we don't have a magic pill that we can give them to give their loved one, to help their loved one, and they don't stay. Well, I had been in and out, and I could choose to stay. I had seen some miracles happen. I knew what could happen and what could be possible. So June 15th, 1990, I made a commitment that I was going to live this way of life for the rest of my life. And since that time, I've been a very continuing and active member of the Worldwide Fellowship of Al-Anon and Alateen. And it has changed everything in my life. Everything in my life is different because of recovery. And it has been a wonderful, wonderful journey and continues to be. May 18th, 1991, I was living in Dothan, Alabama, another bigger town in Alabama on the eastern side of our state. And I woke up that morning and decided I was going to go to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, way up north, to see my daughter, who was the absolute best thing to come out of my first marriage. She had graduated high school and had gone to college, and I want to mention here that anybody I talk about in my story has given their approval for me to do that. And she was in college, and I had not heard from her in 3 months, and that was very unusual because we were pretty close. But you see, I'd been back in Al-Anon about a year now, and I was really trying to do the best I could at the time with what I had to work this program. So I was waiting on God to let me know what to do. And I woke up that morning and I knew it was time to go see Amanda. So I called my two best friends. I said, will you go with me? And they said yes. And we got in the car and we trekked off to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, about 4 hours north. We got there and got to the apartment complex where my daughter lived. And out front there was a bank of mailboxes out front of the apartment complex. And there was mail scattered all over the ground. So we went over and started picking up the mail, and it all had my daughter's name on it. So we gathered up the mail and we put it in the car. And we went to the door, knocked, nobody answered. I said, I'm going to go get the apartment manager to come open up the apartment, and we're going to see what's been going on with Amanda. So one friend stayed there, and the other friend went with me, and we were going down the stairs, and my friend Melody called out, and she said, Angie, she's here. And I turned around and walked back, and my daughter Amanda was standing in the doorway, and I went up to her, and I hugged her, and I said, Amanda, I love you, and it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. We walked inside, sat down, talked for a few minutes. And I don't know if this has been your experience, but it has been mine. If I'm working my program the way I know I need to work my program, if I'm going to meetings, if I'm being active, if I'm trying to be as spiritually fit as I can, if I'm trying hard to be a servant to God and my fellows, then sometimes God just does for me what I can't do for myself. And just about that whole day was that kind of day. We sat down and talked for a few minutes, and I said, Amanda, I want you to know that I know something's wrong. I don't know what it is, but I know there's something. And so in my mind, I'm thinking this is a good start, you know. And then I said, I want you to know that I'm here today to make you an offer. And you know, in my mind, I was thinking, I wonder what the offer's going to be. I said, I'm here today to do whatever I have to do to get you help. I'm willing to take you wherever I need to take you. I'm willing to do whatever I need to do. I'm willing to pay whatever I need to pay. I'm willing to do whatever my part is. And inside, I'm thinking, oh, this is so good, you know. And I said, I'm willing to do it. If you accept my offer, that's exactly what I'm going to do. And if you don't accept my offer, that's okay too. We're going to spend the day together. We'll have lunch together. We'll have a great time together. I'm still going to be your mother. I'll always love you. But I'll never make this offer again. And you know, inside, I was just screaming at that point, don't do this, Angie. Don't tell her that. And then I stood up and I said, and you have an hour to make up your mind. And, you know, I was just screaming, don't do this. But I did. I left. And I came back an hour later, and I'd been crying because I knew she wasn't going to accept the offer. My friend that went with me said, what are you going to do if she does? And I said, it's not going to matter. We walked back inside, sat down, talked a few minutes, and Amanda said, Mama, I accept your offer. And you know my mind was a total blank. A total blank. But then a name came to me of a therapist way down in South Alabama on the western side of our state. And I called Information. Now, there are some people in here that don't know, but we used to have a woman called Information. And her phone number was 411. And you could call her. And if I had given permission for her to give out my phone number, you could call and she would give you my phone number. And so that's what I did. I called Information and I gave her the therapist's name, and Information gave me her number, and I called her. This was Saturday, probably around 11 o'clock in the morning. I told her who I was. I told her a little bit of information. By this time, my daughter had told me she had written a few bad checks. So I told the therapist my daughter had written a few bad checks. She said, what do you think's wrong with her? I said, I don't know. She said, maybe she has a mental illness. And I said, maybe she does, because I knew a little bit about mental illness. You know, I thought, we'll get her some good therapy. She might need some medication for a while, and she'll be okay. So we talked a little bit, and the therapist called me back a little bit later, and she said, you need to have her at Providence Hospital in Mobile, Alabama at 9 o'clock in the morning. Providence Hospital way down western side of our state. I said, okay, and I did. At 9 o'clock the next morning, Amanda was admitted into Providence Hospital. And at that time in the hospital, they had a floor of their hospital. Half of the floor was for persons with mental illness, and half of the floor was for persons with alcohol and drug problems. And so Amanda was admitted to the half of the floor for persons with mental illness. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Thomas, and I talked for a little bit. And he said, what do you think's wrong with your daughter? And I want to mention here that Dr. Thomas has passed on. He has gone on to that great meeting in the sky. And I told Dr. Thomas, I said, I don't know. She's written a few bad checks. And he said, maybe she has a mental illness. And I said, maybe she does. And I left her there and I went home. Every weekend I would go see Amanda. And every weekend she would tell me very serious and dramatic things that had happened in her life. Serious things that I didn't know anything about. But for me, the most serious thing she told me was the day that she told me that she was an alcoholic. Because you see, I had been running from the disease of alcoholism and to the disease of alcoholism all of my life. And I knew I had a decision to make that day. Was I going to run from Amanda, or was I going to run to her? When I got home that day, I fell on my knees and I took step one in a way I had never taken it before. I knew my life was unmanageable. I could see the unmanageability all around me. But I did not want to admit I was powerless. I don't know why I clung so hard to that illusion of power. But boy, I did. Until that day. And I let it go. I went to the next Al-Anon meeting. I asked Debbie if she'd be my sponsor. And we dove into the steps in a way I had never done before. I worked the steps with Debbie the way she had worked them with her sponsor. So we had a study guide, and there was a lot of reading to do. There were lots of readings to do for each step, and then there were 12 questions to answer for each step. And so I dove into that with Debbie. Step 2 was easy for me. I have always known that there is something greater than me in the universe. My ego's not that big. I've always known there was something greater than me, and I choose to call that God. So step 2 was easy. But step 3 was a little bit harder because I tried to live my life kind of just under the radar of God. Just skimming along there right under his view. Because I believed if God ever really saw me, if he ever truly saw me, he would not want someone like me that had done the things that I had done to live on this beautiful earth that he had created. So I just tried to hide from him. So when I got to step 3, that was hard. Because now I'm asked to turn my will and my life over to the care of this God that I've been hiding from. But I figured out a way to do that. I said, I am going to do that. I will make that decision and do that one day. I'll do it one day. Well, the day we did step 3, I met Debbie at the clubhouse as I did for every step. We went in and we talked and I answered those 12 questions. And I never told Debbie I was saying one day. I am so grateful for a strong arm of my Al-Anon ancestry that goes like this. It goes from Lois Wilson, the co-founder of Al-Anon, to Arbutus in Texas, from Arbutus to a couple other ladies, and then to Lou Bell in Little Rock, Arkansas, the wife of Joe and Charlie, and then to Mary Pearl in North Little Rock, Arkansas, to Debbie in Delville, Alabama, to me. And you know, when Arbutus was spreading the good news of Al-Anon in Texas, all she had to spread it with was the big book of AA and later the 12 and 12. Thank you, Alcoholics Anonymous, for allowing us, and I've been told some 300 other kinds of anonymous groups, to use that literature. Thank you. And in my lineage, as the wonderful Al-Anon literature has been written and published, we use every bit of that Al-Anon literature. That study guide gets updated as new books get added, and we use all that literature. But we also have always used our foundational text, the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12 and 12. So when I finished step 3, Debbie said, okay, when you get up in the morning, you're going to say the 3rd step prayer. And you'll say it every day for the rest of your life. And when you get to step 7, we added that one on as well. So when I got up the next morning, I had to say the 3rd step prayer. And as you know, it starts off, God, I offer myself to thee. And it wasn't one day. It wasn't one day. It was right now. And you know, for a while, I would just sob when I said that prayer, because I just knew God was just going to kill me, because I knew he was seeing me now. When I sponsor people, I think about that a lot. I would have done and did do whatever Debbie suggested I do. Well, I didn't die, and I stopped crying, although I will say I still do get misty-eyed sometimes when I say those prayers. Then there came a time I started singing them. A lot of days now I sing them, and at the end I say, God, what mission have you got for us today? Let's get on with it. When I finished that 3rd step, Debbie handed me a packet of paper, 30 pages front and back, single-spaced, question after question after question after question about my life. Early childhood all the way up. She said, this is your 4-step inventory. Well, I got that paper, and I was looking through there hard, and I was already bargaining with God. And we always met right before our Al-Anon meeting, so I'm over there at my spot, and the meeting's starting, and I'm going through those pages. And I am talking to God in my head. And I'm telling God, I know I'm not supposed to tell Debbie. You see, I had something that I had figured I was never supposed to tell anybody. I'm sure nobody in this room has ever had anything like that, but I did. And I had always rationalized and justified why I never had to tell it. So I was going through those pages, and I'm bargaining with God, and I'm telling God, I know I'm not supposed to tell Debbie. But just in case I am, it's going to say, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. It's not going to say da-dee-dee-dee-dee or da-da-da-da. God, it's going to say the exact words, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And if it does, then I know I have to tell her. Well, sure enough, about 3/4 of the way through that packet, about halfway down that page, there it was, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And I knew I was going to have to tell her. I knew I was going to have to tell her. And I knew when I did, our relationship was going to change. For me, the day I did step 5, it could have been one question. I got to the clubhouse before Debbie. I watched her drive up. I watched her get out of her car. I watched her walk up to me, because I knew when we got to that question, things were going to change. We walked inside and sat down, and she would ask the question, and I would answer it. And we got to that question, and she asked it, and I answered it. And I started crying. And she came around and stood behind me, and she just hugged me. And I felt something on top of my head, and it was her tears. And you know, in that instant, the shame and the guilt that I had felt about what I had done was gone. It was just gone. Now, I still felt responsible. I need to feel responsible for every action and behavior of my life. But the shame and the guilt were what was just killing me, and it was gone. And my relationship with Debbie did change that day. We were closer than we were before we went in that room. And that day, I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that Debbie loved me. And I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that God loved me. And I didn't anticipate or expect either of those things to happen when I did that step 5. Step 6 I did, and 7 I did the way I think a lot of people do. I worked each step. I met Debbie. We went over the questions. I was quiet. I prayed. I was quiet for an hour, And then I kind of just waited for God to do whatever God was going to do. Well, I have learned that that's just not the kind of God I have. My God expects me to do my part. I have a part in my life, and my God expects me to do it. And every time I do it, he shows up. Every time I do it. There have been 3 books over the years that have really helped me understand steps 6 and 7 in a way that nothing else has. And those 3 books are Drop the Rock, The Ripple Effect, and Steps and Stories by Sandy Beach. And I live with steps 6 and 7 a lot today because I understand, and they're very meaningful steps for me now. Amanda stayed in that hospital for 2 months. The day that she admitted she was an alcoholic, they just packed up her stuff and moved her from the side of the floor for persons with a mental illness to the side of the hospital floor for people with alcohol and drug problems. Wasn't that just the neatest thing, you know? So she stayed there 2 months, and the day I went to pick her up, I had a contract for her to look at. I had written the contract. You see, I come from a long line of martyrs. You know what a martyr is. Woe is me, I can't believe you're doing this to me. Look at all I'm doing for you. How could you do this? Blah, 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 you know. And I didn't want to be that person anymore. So the contract was for me. It was to keep things even-steven if Amanda decided to come live with me till she could kind of get back on her feet. So she got the contract and looked at it, and it said things like this. It said, I agreed not to have men spend the night overnight in our home. She agreed not to have men spend the night overnight in our home. I agreed she could live with me for a while. She agreed to pay me $100 a month rent. I agreed I would buy the groceries. She agreed to cook 3 nights a week. I agreed she could use my car some because she didn't have a car at that time. She agreed she would keep my car cleaned and detailed. You see, for everything I agreed to do, she had to agree to do something. Oh, and I had gone through all that mail and had talked to some people, and I had found out that Amanda was facing, at a minimum, 15 years at Tutwiler Prison for Women in Alabama because of the amount of bad checks that she had written. We didn't know how much would be added on because of what she had done, but just the amounts would give her at least 15 years at Tutwiler Prison for Women. So I had paid all that off. It was over $10,000. And the contract said that Amanda had 10 years to pay me back, or she would go to Tutwiler Prison for Women in Alabama. I'm proud to say she paid the money back in 8 years. Well, if Amanda was here tonight, she would tell you that she looked at that contract and she thought, prison or mama? Prison or mama? Well, she chose mama, and she signed the contract, and I signed it, and we went home to learn how to be a family in recovery. And it was quite eventful. I'm going to share a couple of quick stories about that. Amanda had been living with me several months, and if you know my daughter, some of you do, she's quite outgoing, she's very vivacious, she's a lot of fun, she loves life. So she'd been living with me several months, and she came home one day and she said, Mama, you know I'm doing everything you want me to do. I got a sponsor, I'm working the steps, I'm going to meetings, I got 6 part-time jobs, I'm working, I'm going, I'm doing, I'm keeping the house clean, I'm keeping your car clean, I'm cooking. Mama, I'm doing all that stuff, but I just don't think I'm going to have the rent money tomorrow. But Mama, I'm doing everything else you wanted me to do. And so I said, Amanda, you are absolutely right. You have done more than I've ever imagined that you would do. I hope you are so proud of all these things that you're doing. And it's okay if you don't have the rent money when I come home tomorrow. Because you see, before you came to live with me, I talked to the Salvation Army here in Dothan. And they told me anytime I needed to, I could drop you off and they would give you 2 hots and a cot. So when I get home tomorrow, it's okay if the rent money's not on the table. I'm still going to be your mother. I'm still going to love you. We'll still do things together. We'll still be happy. But I'm going to drop you off at the Salvation Army, and you will never live with me again because you will have broken our contract. And anything you want, you better take with you because whatever you leave here is going to be mine. Well, y'all, her eyes were big as dinner plates. And I went in the bathroom, and I got in the shower, my favorite place to cry, and I just boo-hooed. I boo-hooed because I knew I could do that. I knew I could. You see, there had been some times in Amanda's life that I would say things to her that I wouldn't say to the checkout clerk at the grocery store. There'd been some times in her life that I would use a tone of voice that I wouldn't use with a teller at the bank. There'd been some times in her life that I would roll my eyes or do gestures with my hands or shrug or do other stuff, you know, that I wouldn't do with a stranger that I'm sitting next to on a plane. And I truly believe that day that those days were pretty much over because I could finally see my daughter as a human being deserving of respect and dignity. You know, this lady came up to me one time and she said, your daughter might deserve respect and dignity, but my son doesn't. He has stolen from us. He's thrown up in my car. He's just treated us terrible. And I said, no, ma'am. I said, you're so wrong. I said, your son deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, if for no other reason than because he's a precious child of God. And see, Amanda was a precious child of God. And if any of us in this room had a contract, and one of us broke it, there would be consequences for that. That's just how the world is. And Amanda was deserving of that same dignity and respect that any of us would be. The next day I came home and the rent money was on the table, and it was there every month until she moved out. Another thing I started learning that year that I still learn today goes like this. If my name is not in the sentence, it is none of my business. And this is how that works. Sometimes I would say something to Debbie like, I wonder if Amanda's going to her meetings. And Debbie would say, Angie, your name is not in that sentence. So then I would say, I wonder if Amanda, Angie's daughter, is going to her meetings. She'd say, you cannot do that. Your name is not in that. Here's some other sentences that I learned do not have my name. Is Amanda going to her meetings? Does Amanda have a sponsor? Is Amanda working the steps? Is Amanda being a good home group member? And as the years have gone on, is Amanda being a loving wife? Is Amanda being a kind mother? Is Amanda being an upstanding citizen? Is Amanda speaking her truth and kindness and love? And on and on and on. My name is in none of those sentences. But here's some sentences that do have my name. Is Angie going to her meetings? Is Angie working her steps? Is Angie being a good home group member? Is Angie being a loving wife? Is Angie being a kind mother? Is Angie being an awesome grandmother? Is Angie being an upstanding citizen? Is Angie being a woman of dignity and grace and speaking her truth and kindness and love? And on and on and on. I learned that my name was in enough sentences. I really didn't have time left over to worry about those sentences that don't have my name. Amanda celebrated 32 years in Alcoholics Anonymous this year because of the program that she works, because of the God of her understanding, because of wonderful sponsorship that she's had over the years, and because of a terrific family of recovery that she's part of. She sponsors women. She speaks on occasion. She's raised 2 beautiful children with her wonderful husband, Gary, who's just a normal fella that we absolutely adore. You know, he's one of the few normal fella people I know, so he's great. He is great. She has 2 beautiful children. Annabelle will be a senior in college this year, and my grandson, Kip, will be a freshman in college. And they're wonderful. They're wonderful. And Amanda and I love each other. We're still mother and daughter. Sometimes I think that there's tension just built into those 2 words, mother and daughter, you know. But we love each other, and we have a good time together. We have a good time together. And it's all because of recovery. My mother never did get in recovery. The last few years of her life, she had COPD and emphysema such that she could no longer drive. So she could not drive to the liquor store to buy the alcohol. And at that time, if you could have it delivered, she didn't know how to do that. So for the last few years of her life, she did not drink, but she did not have any kind of recovery. And she would stay with me 2 or 3 weeks out of the month, and with my daughter 2 weeks out of the month because I was out of town some of those days. And then 3 out of 4 weekends, I would take my mother to her home in Andalusia, and I would stay there with her for the weekend so she could be at her house. I never could have done those things without the rooms of Al-Anon and Open AA, because that's where I learned how to be a loving daughter. I didn't learn it in one Al-Anon meeting a week. You know, when I got in recovery, Debbie said to me, Angie, you have the family disease of alcoholism, and it's going to serve you well to learn everything you can about the disease. And us Al-Anons, we usually have maybe 1 state convention a year, 1 district picnic, and 1 workshop, and that's usually all we have. But I tell you, AA folks are doing stuff all the time, and almost all of it is with Al-Anon participation. We would rent a house at the lake, and there'd be 35 or 40 of us, and you wouldn't know who was AA or who was Al-Anon, and we'd go up, and we'd have people to bring their boats and their food, and we'd have cookouts, and we'd have a 12-step weekend or a big book weekend or a promise weekend. I had studies at my home, book studies. We went to roundups. We went to conventions. We went to whoopee parties. We just had a good time. We just had a good time. And I learned from you and people just like you how to be a loving mother and a loving daughter. I would hear your stories. You know, I have some Al-Anons tell me sometimes they've never heard an AA speaker. Oh, I don't go to that. I get something from every speaker I hear. If I go with an open mind and I say, I'm going to take something away from this, I take something away from it. And that's what I did. I heard you talk about how you were loving to your moms and loving to your dads. And sometimes they would come to events and I would see how you treated them. And I learned that a man could love me and not want to have sex with me. I learned that I could love a man and he would not expect sex from me. I learned to love women. When I came to Al-Anon, I did not even like women. I learned to love women. I had dads and uncles and a family that I always dreamed of in the rooms of recovery. So when I needed to step up for my mother, I could. And I could be that loving daughter that I wanted to be because people just like you had taught me how to do that. One day my mother was sitting on the couch and she said, you know, I know you talk about me when you speak. And at that time I did not talk about her at all. And I said, no, ma'am, I don't. And she said, I know you do. And I said, no, ma'am, I don't talk about you when I speak. And then she said, I know you talk about when I used to beat you. And you know, my heart just about stopped because we had never talked about that in public or private, and I was not going to talk about it then. And so I said, no, ma'am, I don't talk about that. And she said, I know you do. And I said, no, I do not talk about that. And then she said what I think was she was trying to make amends to me the best she knew how. She said, well, you know, I didn't beat you every day. And I thought, we're here. You know, we're here. And so I said, no, ma'am, you didn't beat me every day, but you beat me many days. And one day was one day too many. And then I had what happened to me happen to a speaker I heard taught one time. And I believe that God let me see my mother the way I think he probably saw her. My mother had always been 60 feet tall to me. Well, that day I saw her. I saw this tiny little shriveled up 82-year-old woman sitting on the couch with the pajamas on in the middle of the day with the oxygen tubes in her nose, tethered to this big old machine for the rest of her life. I saw this woman that was scared, lonely, frightened. I saw a woman that had lived behind a 10-foot concrete wall all of her life, that nothing could get in and nothing could get out. I saw a woman who was a fantastic military officer's wife. She could be beautiful. She could be elegant. She could put on a buffet or a party or a cocktail party that nobody could beat. She could be whatever she wanted to be whenever she needed to be. And she was also an alcoholic who beat me. I saw who I think I probably would have been without the rooms of Al-Anon. And I walked over and I knelt down in front of her and I said, Mom, I want you to know I have forgiven you for that. I have forgiven you for every hit, every drop of blood, every lick, everything. I forgave you for that years ago. Do you remember that day I came to see you and talk with you about things that I had done to you and how I wanted to try to set that right? She said, yeah, I do. And I said, well, I had already forgiven you that day. And that's why I tell this story. When I got to step 8 and made my list, Debbie said, oh, we've got some work to do here. She said, yes, everybody on this list you have hurt. But a lot of these people have hurt you. And she said, Angie, you've got to work on forgiveness. Because before you can go make amends, you have got to forgive them. So that when you do go make your amends, you can go with a heart full of nothing but love. So that no matter what they say or what they do, you will have done your part with love. And I had worked on forgiving my mother a long time before I ever went to her. But you see, I didn't tell her that. I didn't tell her that. So I told her that day. I said, Mom, I forgive you and I love you. And we hugged each other and we cried together. And I think it was the second time in my life that I ever saw my mother cry. I know my mother gained a new sense of freedom that day. And I know I gained a new sense of freedom that day too. In 2004, I was doing an inventory and I realized that while I had turned over many things to God, I had never turned over the part of my life that had to do with male-female relationships to God. I don't know why I would not give that to God. By now, the wreckage is up to my chin. I'm kind of holding it up, my chin up, you know, and I'm still thinking I can do it better. But that day, I gave it up. I gave it up. I said, God, I can't do this. I've never known how to do this. I don't know how to do it now. I'm just done. I'm just done. I'm going to stop looking. I'm going to turn down dates. I'm just not going to be involved anymore. I'm going to get in therapy. I'm going to start going through all this wreckage and look and see how I got here. I'm going to learn how to be a happy, joyous, and free single woman in recovery. And that's how I'm going to live my life. And I looked at step 11. I looked at my prayer and meditation. And I looked at my view of God. And God was a big kahuna in the sky to me. And I wanted him to be a big kahuna in the sky. But I also wanted him to be my best friend. I wanted to be able to talk with him just like I'm talking right now. I wanted him to be with me in the car. I wanted him to be with me in the bathroom when I was at work and when I'm behind a podium. I wanted him to be with me everywhere. And he wasn't. He was this big kahuna in the sky, which I wanted him to be. But I also wanted him to be right down here with me. So I changed up my prayer life. I changed up my spiritual life. I started doing some things different. Got in therapy. And I went on an 8-year journey. Now, I didn't know it was going to be 8 years when I started it. This cute young woman came up to me one time. I hope I see her again one day. She was probably 22 or 23. And she said, "Oh, my God, Miss Angie, are you telling me I can't date for 8 years?" And I said, "No, honey, I'm not telling you that. I don't know how much wreckage you've got. I had a lot of wreckage to go through. But I am telling you this. Don't settle. Don't settle. We know when we're settling. We feel that little nudge. We hear that little voice. I settled about so many things in my life. I settled about jobs. I settled about marriages. I settled about divorces. I settled about moving. I settled about so many things. I don't know how many times I settled right before God was going to give me a miracle. And then it struck me, I don't know how many miracles I've kept other people from having. Because right before God was going to give them one, I would get in there. I would enable. I would control. I would manipulate. All in the name of doing good. But I would do it. Right before God was going to do no telling what for them. I made a commitment that day that I was never going to interfere in anybody else's miracles anymore. So, I did that for 8 years, was on that journey. March 8th of 2014, I was going to the Flint River Roundup in Albany, Georgia. I was going to host Bo T, a dear friend of mine, and my daughter Amanda was hosting his wife Shirley. And I'm going through the house, and I'm just talking away to God, because you see, now God's my best friend, and I can just talk away to him. So I'm just talking away to God. And as I was leaving the house, I said, "God, I just want you to know that I have done everything you've wanted me to do, and I'm ready." Well, I shot myself. And I got to Albany. I was pretty emotional getting over there, and I was rooming with a friend of mine named Jean. Jean still remembers the day that I walked in that room, because she said when I walked in, she knew something was different. I walked in, and she said, "Angie, what is it?" So I told her. I told her about what I was talking to God, and I said, "And I just told God, Jean, I've done everything you wanted me to do, and I just want you to know that I'm ready." And then I said, because I have that kind of God, let's see how long it takes God. Well, Chip, my husband, and I have a picture on our refrigerator that my daughter Amanda made less than 24 hours later, when a 14-year friendship started to change. You see, I had told God, if you do see fit to put another man in my life, God, you're going to have to put him there and hold him there, because I'm not going to be looking. So I guess 14 years was long enough. Our relationship started to change that day. 6 months later, we were married. And I've had my first ever 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th wedding anniversaries. And I will tell you that this marriage thing is just pretty good. It is pretty good. When we got married, Chip had 26 years in AA, and I had 24 years in Al-Anon. And so my sponsor said, "Well, this marriage is starting off with 50 years. I think it might have a chance." And it has. I love Chip. I adore my husband. I adore him. And we have had a great time. He's had some physical issues that are getting pretty serious. But the motto of our marriage before we got married we said the motto of our marriage is going to be fearless. And that's what we have been. And we have traveled and had fun and done recovery stuff and just had a grand time. And learned how to be a married couple. Learned how to do that. And it's been great fun. And this is another thing I learned. I thought I was waiting on God for that 8 years. But you see, God was waiting on me to do the work and then tell him I was ready. So that's what I tell people. Do the work and then tell God you're ready and hang on. Hang on. So that brings me to step 12. I have had a spiritual awakening. Not because I go to meetings, not because I set up chairs at my home group, not because I speak sometime. Those things are important to me, and they're part of my program. But that's not why I've had a spiritual awakening. I've had a spiritual awakening because I have worked the steps with a sponsor who has worked the steps. Now what do I do with this spiritual awakening that I've had? I'm going to tell a couple of stories and then I'll be through. I can have a spiritual awakening and I can just be spiritual all over the place in my hour Al-Anon meeting. That's not usually where my problem lies unless it's a business meeting. Once in a while I have a problem in a business meeting. But my problems lie in the other 23 hours of the day when I'm out there in the world. So, how do I live when I'm out there in the world? 5 or 6 years ago, I realized one day that I was saying things on social media that a woman of dignity and grace did not need to be saying. I was arguing with people. I was fussing with people. I was not using dignity and grace language. I was not being a woman of recovery. I was bad. I was bad, y'all. And my sponsor is not on social media. So she did not know what I was doing. But you know, I have sponsees that are on social media. And they did know what I was doing. So finally I called my sponsor today's name, Mary Beth. So I called Mary Beth and I said, Mary Beth, I got a confession to make. And I told her what I'd been doing. She said, oh my God, Angie. I said, I know it. She said, we've got some work to do. She said, we got to look at causes and conditions. We got to look at what got you here, and we got to look at what we're going to do about it. Well, what we're going to do about it was pretty easy. I had to go on social media world and make amends, and I did. I went on social media world, and I said basically, I'm here today to say that I have been doing and saying things that a woman of dignity and grace does not need to be doing and saying. I want to do everything I can to set that right. Here is all of my contact information. If I have done anything that has offended, caused you harm, or caused you any kind of stress, please contact me, and I'm going to do everything I can to set it right. And I make a commitment today that from this day forward, I'm going to do everything I can to remain a woman of dignity and grace on all social media, and I have done that. And then we looked at how I had gotten there, and how I had gotten there was I was living again in a place of fear. When I got into recovery, I lived most of my life based on fear. I made decisions based on fear. I married based on fear, divorced based on fear. My life was just fear. But when I got in recovery and worked the steps, the fear went away. I didn't work on fear. It was just over the course of doing the steps, I realized one day that I wasn't afraid anymore. And that fear stayed gone until it came back. And for me, always under fear is a lack of faith and trust in God. So I had to ramp up my spiritual life, and when I ramped up my spiritual life, the fear went away. And I know if I stay spiritually fit, that fear's not going to come back. A few years ago, I was watching the news one night, and the newscaster was talking about all these people doing all this stuff to all these other people in all these ways and all this stuff, you know. And in the middle of the newscast, I said, oh my God, how can you do this? How can you love all the people this newscaster is talking about just as much as you love me? I don't have any ego, do I? How can you do that, God? How can you love all those people just as much as you love me? And I went on a rant at God for weeks. I was so angry at God. I was so mad at God. How could he do that? Surely there was a hierarchy, and surely I was at the, close to the top, and those other people were way down at the bottom, How could he love us all the same? How could he? I talked to my sponsor, I inventoried, I did all kind of stuff. It just didn't help. But I finally got to a place I knew I was at a crossroads, and this was a crossroads. Was I going to believe in an all-encompassing God of love? Or was I going to believe in a little bitty God that looked like me, talked like me, acted like me, voted like me, believed like me? Which was I going to pick? An all-encompassing God of love or a little God just like me? Well, I knew what I was going to have to say, so I stayed mad at God another week before I made that decision. But then I finally said, I'm going to believe in that all-encompassing God of love. That's what I want in my life. And I knew when I said that what it meant was that God expected me to love all the people on that newscast just as much as God loved me. And so that's the journey I've been on. And I'll be on that journey, I believe, for the rest of my life. Sometimes it means finding one grain of sand in common with somebody. If you live at the beach, trying to find one particular grain of sand is a pretty tall order. But I believe I'm charged to do that. You see, I believe when I got in recovery, that I started being held to a higher standard. I've been pondering recently, what does program of attraction mean? We are a program of attraction, not promotion. Well, most people never come to our meetings, so the program of attraction is not the meeting. Most people never read our literature unless they get in the program, so the program of attraction is not the literature. So I've come to the conclusion that the program of attraction is me, and the program of attraction is you. What do people think of recovery when they see me? What does the lady that serves me at Starbucks usually think if she comes to my meeting Tuesday and she sees me sitting there? What does she think about Al-Anon? What does the checkout clerk in the grocery store think if somebody comes up to me and starts talking to me about recovery stuff, which happens sometimes? What does she think about recovery, knowing that I come in that store a lot? What does she think? What kind of attraction do I have? What kind of attraction do I have? This is my last story. In 2014, Chip and I were at the Gulf Coast Jubilee in Gulf Shores, Alabama, and we were in the food line waiting to be served. And it was Chip and me, and in front of me was a young man named John. And John is a very, very dear friend of my daughter's. He was then and he is today. And at that time, John was 38 years old, and he had been in AA 4 years. So we're talking, and I'm asking John, how's it going? What's happening? And so he's telling me, and he gets real serious. And he said, Angie, he said, I'm really having a hard time. And I said, you are? He said, yeah. He said, I'm on step 9. And he said, I want to make amends to my parents, but they both passed on. John's dad died when he was 9, and his mother died when he was 28. And he said, I'm just really struggling. Well, I have kind of a standard thing I usually say when somebody tells me that they're trying to make amends to somebody that's passed on. But I felt that little nudge, and I heard that little voice. So that's not what I said. What I said was, well, John, we're standing right here. And John looked at me and looked at Chip, and he got real teary, and he said, oh, my God, would you be my parents? And Chip and I looked at each other, and we got teary, and we said, absolutely. So since 2014, we have a son named John, and John is our son of the heart, and he is truly our son. We love John. John loves us. He wanted to come to the beach and get a job, and he got a fabulous job at the beach. So he came down and he lived with us for 6 months before he found a place to stay. So he lived with us, and he'd come home every evening, and I'd have dinner ready just like my mother always did. And we'd sit around the dinner table and talk. And, one night he said, Angie, I can't remember the last time I came home to family. And I said, John, I can't remember the last time family came home. Because Amanda had moved out and been away from home for a long time. She comes and visits, but she hadn't lived with us, And then one day John said this. He said, Angie, he said, my parents loved me so good, but they didn't know all of who I am. And he said, you and Chip know all of who I am, and you love me so good. And I knew in that instant why that day I hadn't said my standard response to John. He had to have a hip replacement last year, and he came to our house to recover. He's getting another one next week, and I get to take him to the hospital, and he's got to come to our house and recover because he lives up 2 flights of stairs, so he can't do that right when he has his hip done. And we love John, and John loves us. John loves Amanda. When we have holidays, John's there. We're all there together, and we're a family. We're a family of recovery. A family of recovery. While we've been here this weekend, things have kind of opened back up now, and people are getting together, and they're having events like this. And they're all doing what we're doing this weekend. They're all sharing their language of the heart with each other. My name is Angie Bowdren, and I thank you for letting me share my language of the heart with you, and I hope to hear your story. Thank you.